and welcome to the Knowledge Pool. Today I'll be teaching you the process of casting a spell in Magic the Gathering. So without further ado, let's begin. First of all, I know what you are all thinking. Casting a spell is simple. We just pay our mana, follow the text on the card, and the spell is cast, right? Well, that's technically correct. There are some certain steps that need to be followed, and if we are not able to follow those steps, then the spell casting is considered illegal. The game state needs to be returned to the moment before the spell was cast. The same goes if there is a certain effect that prohibits us from casting a spell with a certain quantity. We need to go back again because it's an illegal cast. If none of those are true, then we can cast a spell as normal. And we'll go to the first step of casting a spell, which is the announcement. So the first part of casting a spell is the announcement of such spell, where we take the spell from where it is, usually the hand, and we move it on the stack where we cast the topmost object. This phase also includes the choice of a phase of a split card, whether we fuse a card, the phase of a model double-faced card, or the casting of a spell with morph. After this step is completed, we move to the next step, which is known as the choice step or the status quo step. The second part of casting a spell includes all kinds of choices we get to make except the targets of a spell. So that means choices on a model spell, whether we splice a card on another card, whether we pay additional costs like kicker and buyback, whether we pay alternative costs like a force of will exiling a blue card. We also determine the value of X in X spells or abilities in this step, how we will pay for the hybrid mana different cards, how we will pay the free X and mana cost on different cards, and also keep in mind that in this step we cannot choose two different alternative methods of casting or two alternative costs of casting a spell. After all of those choices are made, we move to the next step, which is the targets. The third part of casting a spell is choosing the targets for that spell. This is pretty simple. We look at the word target in the text of a spell and we choose the appropriate targets. Keep in mind though, some spells may have ways to add targets or remove targets based on choices made on the previous step, like say casting a bestow creature, which is an aura now, so it has a target. Also, for each instance that the word target appears on a card, we can choose the same target even for that card. For example, a card like Seeds of Strength says 3 times that we can target the creature, so we can target the same creature with all 3 targets. But a spell like Hex, which specifically says 6 target creatures, that means that the targets must be different. Also keep in mind that due to some decisions we made on the previous step, such spells may not have targets anymore. So like an overloaded spell, Cyclonic Rift for example, if we choose to pay the overload cost on the previous step, it will no longer have the word target, but it will have its instead. So it loses all the target ability it had. And again, if a spell has an X targets in its mana cost, like a Crackle with Power, that X is determined on the previous step and then the targets would correspond to that X. Don't be confused though if a spell mentions dividing or distributing, because this comes up in the next step. Step 4 is division/distribution. This comes up only in spells that specifically say divide or distribute, such as Conflagrate and Blessings of Nature. So in this step is where we decide how we'll distribute the counters or deal the damage. It's a step that doesn't come up so soon, but it's still important. It's important to mention here that each target must receive at least one of whatever is being divided or distributed. For example, for Blessings of Nature, we cannot choose 5 creatures since we cannot distribute 5 counters, we only have 4 on disposal. And also if we choose like 4 creatures, we have to give each one of them a counter. We cannot pile them on one and leave the others without counters. But you don't need to worry about that one, because that's what the next step is for, which is the legality check. Fifth step of casting a spell is checking its legality. So here the game checks if the spell can be legally cast, and if it's illegal, we return to the moment before it was cast. This was created back in 2017 due to Ixalan's binding a Squid Immortal, because Squid's ability was that it could be cast from graveyard or from exile, and binding prevented that cast. But because of the rules then, you could move the Squid from the exile to the stack, and then it was no longer exile at binding, and thus the restriction didn't apply. But now, thanks to this step, we check back, we see that binding prevents Swift from being cast, and the goblin can no longer be freed from its prison. So that's also here to stop stuff like Lurus trying to play a Midhook Massacre for an X bigger than 0. So if the check about legality is correct, then we move to the next step, which is to calculate the total cost of our spell. The sixth step of casting a spell is calculating its total cost. We do this in this order. First, we take the mana cost of the card, or the alternative cost if there is one. We add all effects that give the card additional cost, like Thalia, and then we reduce that cost by all the effects that reduce that cost, let's say a Goblin Electromass for an instant. After that, once the total cost is determined, we apply any effects that directly affect the total cost, which is only Trini Sphere for now. And the important thing here is that after all of this process, the total cost becomes locked in, so if any changes occur after this step, they don't apply. After the total cost is calculated, we have a chance, before paying the cost, to activate Mana Abilities, which is the next step. The seventh step of casting a spell is activating Mana Abilities. More specifically, if the spell requires a mana payment, you can choose to activate Mana Abilities in this step of casting the spell. Note here that you could also have activated those abilities prior to casting the spell and using the mana in the next step, but you can also do it on the way of casting the spell. And keep in mind that Mana Abilities doesn't just mean tapping lands for mana. You can also tap creatures like Birds of Paradise, sacrifice creatures like Wild Cantor, use artifacts like Black Lotus and Sol Ring, and also this counts the triggered mana abilities from enchantments like Wild Growth. After we get a chance to activate mana abilities, it's time to finally pay all of the costs. So the 8th and final step of casting a spell is paying for all the costs that were created while casting the spell. And two notes here. One, we have to pay for all the costs. We cannot choose not to pay something. If we cannot pay for something, it's an illegal casting, we need to go back from the start. And also we can pay the costs in any order. Finally, the spell is now cast. We have gone through all of the steps. Any effects that would now modify the characteristics of a spell can no longer be applied, and the spell becomes finally cast. Also, any abilities that would trigger as a spell is cast or is put to the stack trigger at this time. And if we had priority before casting the spell, we get priority again. You have learned how to cast a spell, it's time to put your knowledge to the test. I have prepared a little quiz for you, so please tell me how you did in the comments below. Let's start. For our first example here, there is a graphic sketch on the board, and also we have Future Sight on our side of the board. The top card of our deck is a Zoetic Cavern, which is a land with morph. The question here is whether can we play the lands, the morph spell, or both. So let's examine the situation here. First things first, we check Future Sight. Future Sight allows us to play cards from the top of our library. When we see play on the text of a card, that means you can either play a land if we have available land drops, or cast a spell. Morph is an alternative cost of casting a spell, so we could do both if there was not Grafdigger's Cage on the board. Because of Grafdigger's Cage, we are not allowed to cast a spell as a morph, because that will result it into be a creature which we cast from our library, so we can only play the land if we have a land play available for our turn. For our next question, there is a Witch's Familiar on our side of the board. We have also a Bastion of Remembrance, and we have a Bone Shards with no other cards in hand. The question here is whether we can actually cast the Bone Shards or not. So the answer here is yes, we can actually cast the Bone Shards, and that's because we choose targets for casting a spell before we actually pay all the costs for the spell. And if you remember, what I mentioned is that once the cost and the targets are locked in, nothing will change what happens after that. So here, even though the bone shards will lose its target when it's completely cast and will do nothing and be countered by game effects, we can still cast it because the target was chosen before the sacrifice. So that's a little trick you can use in many effects to get a free sacrifice trigger. For the third question, there is a wall of root with 4, -0, -1 counters on it. And we want to cast a Chord of Calling and use the wall of root for both the mana ability and paying for one of the mana with the Convoke ability. Can we do that or not? The answer here is we actually can if we sequence it correctly. What we mean by that is we go back to our steps and we begin to cast Chord of Calling. On the activating mana abilities, we can use Wall of Root's mana ability to gain a green, and when we pay for the cost, we can tap the Wall of Roots to pay for one of the green pips of Chord of Calling. The reason we can do that because in order for creatures to die from having 0 less toughness, state-based actions need to be checked, and those are not checked while we are casting a spell. So what will happen here is Chord of Calling will be cast for whatever X we choose, and with the Chord of Calling of the stack, the Wall of Roots will die and go to the graveyard. For the fourth question, there is a Training Sphere on the battlefield, and we are trying to cast a Germa Gangler by delving away 6 cards from our graveyard. The question is, when it comes to pay the mana cost, we will pay 3 mana or not? The answer here is that we will not pay any additional mana, and that's because the way Delve and Convoke work is that they say that each card we exile pays for 1 generic mana, which means that it counts as payment even though we are not actually paying with mana. Training Sphere only cares if we pay at least 3 mana, so Delve, Convoke, Improvise get around the Training Sphere requirement. If it was worded like before 2015, where it said that they make the spell cost less, then yes, we actually would need to pay more mana. But as it stands with the current rules, we don't. And for our final question, we have this situation. So we have a Chromatic Sphere on board, and there is a Bear Cub on our opponent's battlefield. We have Collective Brutality in hand, and we want to cast it for 2 of its modes, so we need to escalate it by discarding 1 card. The question is, can we do it? The answer here is surprisingly yes. So here is what happens. We go ahead and announce when we want to cast Collective Brutality. On step 2, we actually choose 2 modes, which means we have an additional cost of discarding a card at the additional cost step. When we try to pay for activating mana abilities, Chromatic Sphere draws us a card, and that happens all as we resolve the mana ability. And so we end up with 1 card in hand. That way, when we go to pay all of the costs, we have a card to discard for Collective Brutality. So yes, we can choose 2 modes with Collective Brutality, one of them being targeting the Bear Cub. So that was all regarding spellcasting. I hope you enjoyed this video, hope you learned something that you could use when you play with your friends, and thank you for watching. This is a passion project of mine, and if you would like to subscribe and leave a like, that would help me a lot. Thank you.